Before we get started on this video, I just want to go ahead and say that this is part 2 of a 2-part video, so if you haven't seen part 1 yet, then you can click anywhere on the screen or there will be a link in the description. Anyways, on the rough topic of character motivation, let's take a little while to talk about Professor Radisson, the main antagonist of the film. I feel like this movie plays a game with its characters, where the basic rules are they try to make a character as unsympathetic as humanly possible, but then expose some sort of great tragedy or some great struggle that they've had to go through, and try to earn them sympathy through the revelation of this one thing. For example, Radisson is an aggressive, militant, anti-religious, anti-Christian professor who forces everyone around him to adopt his basic worldview and essentially expects them to treat him like a god. In addition, he's actually verbally and emotionally abusive towards his girlfriend, partly due to the fact that she is a Christian. But then, in the third act of the film, he reveals that he used to be a Christian, he used to grow up going to church, but he's hated God ever since his mother passed away when he was young. Then, after the final debate, which he loses, as to be expected from a film titled God's Not Dead, he finds a letter that his mother wrote on her deathbed to him, and reads it and then decides that it's time to make a change. He goes out and tries to make amends with his now ex-girlfriend, but on the way to her, he gets hit by a car and accepts Jesus as he's bleeding out on the ground. Next points. 3. Stop making non-Christians villains. I'm not saying we have to make them saints by any stretch of the imagination, but I can say from personal experience that anti-religious bigotry is not a defining characteristic of any non-Christian I know. And Professor Radisson isn't even the only villain in the movie. Amy, who we've already discussed, started out aggressively trying to pursue religious people and saying, hey, why do you believe this? Where do you get off trying to tell us how to live our lives? Of course, she goes through her own various transitions, but it follows the same basic pattern as Professor Radisson. She finds out she has cancer, she begins to question everything, and she ultimately ends up being saved. Amy's boyfriend basically just exists in the movie to be a complete jerk. After he finds out that Amy has cancer, he's just like, well, I guess we had a good run of things, and breaks up with her on the spot. He spends all of his time focusing on business and trying to make his life better from a worldview, and he doesn't even visit his own mother in whatever nursing home. He exists to be terrible, and that's not okay. If at least a partial goal of faith films is to minister to people outside of the church, then we can't accept these characters being the main representation of non-Christians. A recent faith film, but it was technically produced by a secular studio if I'm unmistaken, Risen, actually does a very good job of placing us in the shoes of a non-Christian and helping us understand their motivations beyond, we need to stop this whole Jesus thing because that's what the Roman Empire is supposed to do. Herpa-derpa-derp. And 4, which you could technically argue is kind of an extension of point 3, but I want to make very specific note of this, separate from any of the other points, and that is that the true antagonist of faith films is the true antagonist of faith, and that, of course, is our own sinful nature. A lot of the time, it's easy to sit back, especially in countries that actually do aggressively persecute and kill Christians. It's easy to point at the militant people and say, oh, well, obviously they're the enemy. But really, at the end of the day, in the Christian walk, we are our own worst enemies. And as long as we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, no matter the cost, we will always be carried through our struggles. So yes, we need human characters to oppose our protagonists, but at the end of the day, they are not our enemy. Our enemy is sin. Now, at this point, you might have realized that I haven't really said that much about Josh, the main guy, the main character of the movie. And that's primarily because there's not really that much to say. A common convention of media, most commonly found in video games, is to make the main character somewhat less realized than the people around them, so that the audience is more easily able to insert themselves into that character's position. I'm not overly fond of this particular convention outside of video games, but I can understand its use in this movie in particular. The main problem I have with Josh is that the movie doesn't actually take its own advice. When Josh is first going through the decision of whether or not he'll actually engage in this debate with Professor Radisson, he goes to Reverend Dave for advice, and Professor Dave texts him, and I want to make sure that I get this quote exactly right. "Don't try to be clever. Be content to tell the truth." And that's advice I agree with wholeheartedly. I believe that that is absolutely how we are supposed to conduct ministry, both in art and in real life. However, the final debate, apparently someone decided that the best way to end it was with a mic drop moment. "Why do you hate God?" "Because he took everything from me." "Well, how can you hate him if he doesn't exist?" The movie tries to reach the fulfillment of the central conflict by being clever, apparently having forgotten that it already said not to do that. So, point 5. Don't try to be clever. Be content to tell the truth. Now, I'm gonna be honest, there's a lot more to talk about with this film, but in the spirit of my first point, I'm just gonna go ahead and go through a quick round of a handful of other talking points that I feel are important, but don't really justify lengthening the video to an extreme degree. 6. Celebrity cameos aren't really a bad thing, just try to limit it to people who can actually act. 7. A character I haven't talked about yet is a girl from a Muslim family named Aisha, and she is converted to Christianity, but in order to keep up her cover and not get disowned by her family, she tends to wear a hijab around them, especially in public. But then there's this one random scene where a girl walks up to Aisha as she's wrapping her head because her father's about to pick her up from school, and is just saying, "You're beautiful. I wish you didn't have to cover yourself like that." And I'm not one of those people who's just like, you shouldn't talk about other people's cultures like that, but it was suggesting that covering your head makes you less beautiful, or I don't know. The movie would have just been better without that particular interaction. It added nothing, and it was just weird and random. 8. I get the purpose of Josh's girlfriend as a character, but she just kinda disappears after she breaks up with him. So I'm left asking, did that whole thing really contribute anything? But I guess you could just consider that to be an extension of the first or second points. I don't know. 9. This isn't really a complaint so much as something I've noticed about faith films, but why do so many of them end with either a concert scene or a dance scene? Like, it's something I've noticed about a lot of faith films that I've watched recently, and it's not bad, it's just there are so many better ways to end a movie. From everything I've said so far, it might seem like I'm going out of my way to find problems with this movie, and in a certain sense, I am. But the reason I'm doing it, the reason I'm making this video to begin with, is because I want faith films to be good. Seeing one of my favorite artistic mediums being used as an instrument of worship brings me a great deal of joy, but I feel like we've let artistry just slip to the wayside because we're so focused on making sure that our message is clear, on speaking our message, the message above all else. But I ask, what message would we be preaching if we were constantly pushing the limits of our abilities, artistic and otherwise, for the purpose of bringing a gift of worship to God? Wouldn't it speak greater volumes if we would never settle for our workmanship being okay, and that we would keep working at it until it were truly great. To summarize everything that I've said so far, in my mind, a good faith film would do these things. Focus on telling human stories. A pastor who feels that he isn't being fruitful where he is, having to learn the value of the station that he has in God's plan. A girl being forced to hide her true faith from her family because she's afraid of being disowned or set out onto the street because of their hostility towards her. These are both stories found in God's Not Dead, but they're forced to take a back seat to the central debate. But showing the way God impacts our lives through our faith, through stories about people, is much more powerful than telling us that he's real through an intellectual debate. Understand and embrace the interdependence between artistry and ministry. I do believe that there's a place for purely educational media, but art has the unique ability to exposit eternal truths without having to outright say what it is it's trying to tell us.